All right, so we'll segue into
It's
Hitler.
interesting because of the
Everybody's favorite man, right? The thing about Hitler, though, is that he is sort of the culmination of all this junk that has been published that we've been reading. He has a little bit of this, a little bit of that. He's reacting to communism, the Communist Manifesto. He's reacting against it. He's siding with Nietzsche. All these thinkers that he is employing. So the other reason that he's interesting to watch or important to look at is the amount of evil he accomplished was staggering. He was extraordinarily successful at being very, very evil. And the interesting thing about studying this for me was I usually just study, the World War II, what happened and the results and the concentration camps and all that, and just little quotes here and there maybe from his teachings or his book or his speeches. But this really got into how his anti-Semitism started, his path of thinking, his thoughts, how they evolved. So that's the first time I've really dug into it. It's, wow, the Holocaust is just like, of course that was going to happen with all of these beliefs as a backdrop. And again, I'll say, he published this and they didn't take him seriously. I guess he's not really going to do that. But it was in black and white what he wrote. The Jews are responsible for both Marxism, because Marx was a Jew, and bad capitalism. Those are both Jewish fruits of Jewish influence, and their goal is to take over the world. We need to stop them, was his general thesis about the Jews. I don't know if maybe people shared that and they just didn't want to do anything radical, or why they didn't attack him, but they didn't for the most part. Okay, so he was born in 1889, died in 45. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I think he did kill himself in the bunker. He's dead. He's not still alive today, any of that kind of stuff. And just as a side note, I always continually run into Christians who have these things that circulate around email and whatnot. And I just say to them, look, even if he didn't, who cares? He's dead now, certainly. And what we care about are his thoughts, because that's what killed people. So say he somehow survived and it was a fake suicide or whatever, the conspiracy theorists are. He obviously didn't go and do anything else. So the ideas are what we need to fight today with the neo-Nazis and any other groups that have these thoughts. I see these thoughts in even our American politics at times. So these thoughts we have to attack and be ready and point out when we hear AOC say things, we're like, that's Marxism right there. What you're talking about is utilitarianism. So here's why that doesn't work and blah, blah, blah. We can attack the ideas, not the person. So just a little side note there. He became the chancellor in 1933 and became the Führer in 1934. I forgot to look it up. What's Führer mean? Do you guys remember?
Father?
Probably something like Supreme Commander or
Something like that, yeah. I wanted to get that for tonight, but he maintained the title of Chancellor all the way till the end. So he had two titles all the way through, which I guess when you're a dictator, what do titles even matter? You can just, look, do what I say, I'll kill you. That's just tell me what you want.
How come Colonel Gaddafi wasn't a general? That's what I never understood that one.
Interesting, just like we keep saying, there's an issue with his dad. He feared and disliked his father, so his dad was very overbearing, and his mother died after much suffering. So he was what, about 18? Yeah, about 18, 19 years old. His mom dies after a long, painful death. So here you have a couple roots. You have a bad relationship with a dad and the problem of evil in a young man's life. And then, of course, he went right into World War I shortly after that and saw all sorts of carnage, at least, if not evil. So these basic apologetic questions of why does God allow this or that to happen are all right there with all these figures that we've had. It's just uncanny. I didn't realize. I think we had one exception. Every one of them had a messed up relationship with the dad, or the dad died. And also it's interesting is that in Mein Kampf, he has a flowery depiction of his father. So kind of like trying to sugarcoat it a little bit. But later on, he said more things, and of course, people knew him and his dad, and so history shows that his dad was a tyrant. His dad was a Führer in the home, and maybe even taught Hitler how to do it in the nation. So he wrote the book in 1925, and again, he didn't march into Poland until 1939. It's 14 years where people were looking at what was in print, watching what he was doing, because he was building an army, and all these things were happening to build up to this. And yeah, they tried stopping it diplomatically, and they were taking the threat seriously. But I'm talking about the idea. Where was the book that was published that was the J. Warner Wallace against Hitler's ideas? So apologetics, we were not present. We weren't on the case again, and that's what I want to just keep hammering, that on our level. I mean, I don't know, you guys might be better than me, and you'll go on and do something more. My level is always going to be just peer-to-peer, talking to people, but we all have influence. And so when we're talking to the infamous brother-in-law at Thanksgiving, or our friend at the restaurant or whatever, we're just out doing life with people who don't believe the way we do. We have to engage with them the way that we've been learning, not just in this book, but all the classes all the books we've gone through in this class. We have to try, and if enough of us are trying, then some good will happen. We have evidence of that with the pro-life movement. The public opinion is shifting because of the efforts. We talked about that when we did Margaret Sanger. So we can't let it happen again. It's not our fault. It's Hitler's fault for doing what Hitler did. It's Lenin's fault for doing what he did. It's not the fault of the people, but we all have our own responsibility to be good stewards of what God's given us. And friendships and relationships and influence are tools. They're resources to be stewards of. It's not just money. Stewardship is not a money thing or a time thing only. So just a little side note there. Summarizing it wasn't just Jews, but it was obviously the largest group, 6 million Jews, but political enemies and POWs, of course, but he hit the Slavs, the Gypsies, handicapped and mentally retarded.
Yeah.
Like, you look at the eugenics of Margaret Sanger, and of course he's going to do that. We don't want them reproducing. Now, he went as far as killing them instead of just forced sterilization like we did in the United States. And in other European countries. But the evil of eugenics, you start to see it when it starts to play itself out. Juvenile delinquents and mixed race children. So, boy, there'd be a lot of Americans killed, people in America killed, because we love and try to help people like juvenile delinquents. The interesting thing here, I noticed that he wrote at least the manuscript or the outline while he was in jail. He was in jail for political reasons. You read in the book. He was suspected of being a dissident. And he actually was, I think. But he was in jail for that, and that's when he wrote My Struggle. Another man was in jail for his activity and wrote something else, Martin Luther King Jr. And I just started thinking about these two men. Like, okay, the struggle, what they stood for. While they're in jail, they were inspired to write their thoughts down. One was one of the most evil books in human history, and one is the most beautiful. It's the manifesto for the correct civil rights movement. Remember, we've talked about it in class. He quotes Aristotle. He quotes Thomas Aquinas, and he founds his civil rights entirely on natural law. And he cites our founding fathers, saying what those guys were talking about in the Declaration, that's what I'm talking about here. And you, if you're a moral person, you will hear us out, and you will change your laws. That is basically his argument. And it worked. I mean, that's why it worked. It wasn't only political activity that made it work. So I just thought that was an interesting dichotomy of two men in jail writing their thoughts about their movement. Okay, he looked at problems with the world. Of course, he was worried about Germany, but he talked about all of Europe and, by extension, the world. He had two perils, Marxism and Judaism. When he says Marxism, Karl Marx was Jewish, so he looks at that as a Jewish product just as much as the unfettered capitalism of Jewish commerce. And he saw that as the Jews are behind both of these movements, and they sound like they're opposite, capitalism and Marxism, but it's actually both just a tool of the Jew to try and take over the world. They want to establish a global Israel. That's their goal. Clearly, right? They're like barely hanging on in the Middle East. It's like, just please don't kill us. They don't have global aspirations. So no reason to think these things are true. But they were the scapegoats for all of the problems of Europe. And they had a lot of problems. Like you saw there, that's after the war, of course. But remember, the Great Depression hit the whole world. And he blamed the Great Depression on Jews. Of course, it'd be the capitalist Jews, not the Marxist Jews. That is the problem with the world. Okay, so what did he mean by my struggle? That's the title of the book. What do you mean by that? It is, I can capture this. Within long spans of human progress, it may occasionally happen that the practical politician and the political philosopher are one. His struggle will accordingly be all the more severe and his success all the rarer. That, I think, is the most important thing at least his starting point. He talked, remember, Ben Weicker teaches that very well in here with the quotes and talking about what other Nazis wrote. They looked at good philosophers in history, but they were philosophers. They didn't really know how to get anything done. They knew how to live in their mom's basement and write books. So they couldn't actually make it happen. And you got people who are really, really effective, maybe like a Genghis Khan. He's a great general, all that, but he didn't know that much about, he's not thinking metaphysically. And he says sometimes, rarely, you get this convergence. And he didn't mention it in the book, but I'm sure he was thinking about Alexander the Great. Do you guys know who Alexander the Great's tutor was? Who taught him, I think he was basically his schoolmaster. It was Aristotle. He was taught by Aristotle. So Alexander the Great was actually a very civilized man in a sense. Now he had aspirations of taking over a lot of the world, and he did. But he was a very intelligent, very good philosophically. Of course, we agree with Aristotle. But he obviously thinks of himself as that convergence of philosopher and political leader. But from what we've read, Hitler was not like a genius. He was not a genius. Yeah. He understood enough, and what he was a really good motivational speaker. Which is another reason why when I hear Christian speakers who are really emotive and are just kind of demanding that I get on board with their feelings at that moment, I'm like, no, just tell me what you're saying. If I believe it, I'll get excited about it. But I am not going to listen to you because you're shouting louder or you're saying, hey, can I get a hallelujah? Can I? Maybe, okay, but what are you saying? Just talk to me here. Don't tell me how to respond. That's my personality is more, I was the stubborn child, that just wouldn't do it if I didn't want to kind of thing. And that's good for apologetics. But Christians are guilty of using that. Of course, people, Tony Robbins, the famous motivational speaker, that's him. I mean, he's just flamboyant as can be. I mean, you look at his seminars, and they look like church services. I mean, it's crazy. People are raising their hands and crying, and I think he even has things that look like altar calls. These are business meetings to try and teach them how to be better in their careers, and it's interesting. So Hitler was an amazing motivational speaker, and he knew enough, he was intelligent enough to get the ideas down, but more importantly, he knew how to get people's hearts. And apparently, I guess, initially at least, he was actually pretty funny. He would use humor at the beginning of his talks to get people to kind of lighten up, and then he would tap into he knew how to do that. He could have sold used cars and done really well.
I've heard that, his, 5 other leaders or whatever, they just were looking for a mouthpiece, and they elected Hitler.
Initially.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then he took over.
Took off.
Yeah, he said, sure, I'll be your mouthpiece, and then I'll kill you. He had aspirations way past that, right? So his struggle was, I've got this burden of being the philosopher and the political leader. So that's my struggle. It's my burden that life has asked of me. The universe has asked of me, maybe he would say. Oh, yeah, Adolf Hitler. Wow. I got builds in here that was anticlimactic. Mein Kampf. Okay. The end. Okay. I'm gonna get a little more philosophical. I'm gonna go in the deep end of the pool a little bit here. Some of it's just regurgitating what is in the book to kind of organize the thoughts. But I'm gonna get a little deeper. Right now, remember teleology? What that means? That's a philosophical category.
The purpose. The end purpose.
The purpose of something. The teleology. Teleology is the study of ends, not like finishes. Like, oh, we ended the movie. The end meaning, what is the end goal? Why was this thing made? So the end of cows is to make milk into hamburgers, right? The end of the purpose.
And methane.
Yeah, right. And methane for. I actually talking to Tim. My son's really into science and technology, and he's fascinated that people are turning cow farts into energy.
Oh yeah.
And he's, well, how's that work? I said, well, the one I saw online was they just, would kind of funnel all of the waste into another chamber, and it would continue to produce methane. They would siphon that off. They would turn a turbine, and they produce so much electricity. They not only paid for their whole farm's electric needs, but they fed the grid, and they got checks every month. And they might still be doing it. It was just an experiment. They got paid by the power company because they put more in than they needed. And so you can do that with solar power or whatever. So yeah, maybe that's the end. But actually what that is, that's the telos of human ingenuity. God gave us brains to use them. So teleology is really important to just understand. Of course, there's the teleological argument, which is there is a purpose to this universe. Look at all these laws of physics that don't have to be what they are, but they are. And if they weren't exactly that, life would be impossible. That's just too, that's, the improbability of that is so great that if you say it was an accident, that's absurd. That is bordering on insanity. The most reasonable conclusion to the fine-tuning is that there's a mind that made it this way for a purpose, for a telos. So that's the teleological argument. It's a powerful argument. It's actually what's convinced some very famous atheists, like Anthony Flew was the big one. He said that's what convinced him that God exists. He never accepted Christ, unfortunately, but he was a very famous atheist, died just about 10 years ago, a little less. So powerful. But so Hitler's idea of a telos is that the telos of all social activity must never be merely sentimental charity, which is ridiculous and useless, but it must rather be a means to find a way of eliminating the fundamental deficiencies, the mentally retarded, all the things that he said, the deficiencies, which necessarily bring about the degradation of the individual. So this is eugenics right there. Breed out, and in his case, and kill off until you've pruned what you want. But even there, he says, there's something called a good human that I'm trying to get to. Apologetic moment here. Well, what do you mean by a good human? When you say this is a good one, this is a bad one, you're acknowledging that the mentally impaired has something wrong. Yes, okay, but nature has that all the time, and it happens accidentally. We don't get upset about that when animals have deficiencies. But when a human, you see that there's something wrong with that. Why? And then you get him talking about human nature. There's something called human nature. Where did that come from? What is this thing called nature that we have? Now, he was a Platonist, it sounds like, which I think prevents him from thinking about human nature in this way. Aristotle's is who we get all this from. But you see where right away he's making judgments about what is a good and a bad human, but he's denying all the tools he would need to make that judgment in the first place. Because if there's no God, there's no nature, there's no such thing as a good human, then every instance of humanity, every individual is just whatever. There's no goal. So this isn't a bad human, these aren't bad genes, but this does not matter. It's as indifferent as the rock formations are. You don't say, well, the Rocky Mountains are a good mountain and the Smokies are not. They just are what they are. So he's inconsistent right off the bat. Adolf Hitler, Mein Kampf. But what about anybody have kids with who watched Larry Boy? Okay, it's fun. We used to go back. Okay, the state is a community of living beings who have kindred physical and spiritual natures, interesting, organized for the purpose of assuring the conservation of their own kind and to help towards fulfilling those ends, which I love how he says providence has assigned to that particular race. He talks like he rejected God largely. I got some other slides about his relationship with Christianity. But again, now he's getting even more forceful in his use of teleology, talking about teleology. And yet, everything he stands for just wipes that, it takes the legs out of teleology to begin with. Adolf Hitler. I'm going to get that, there you go, get it out there first. So man will then feel that there cannot be a separate law for mankind in a world in which planets and suns follow their orbits, where moons and planets trace their destined paths, where the strong are always the masters of the weak. So what's he saying? Everything's just material. And you don't rail against moons that behave the way they do or planets the way, it's just material thing, entities living out physical laws. And, the strong beating down and oppressing and killing the weak is just as natural as moons obeying gravity. That's what he's saying there. He's just being a strict materialist in this slide. Again, how do you justify this idea of materialism when in the same other breath, in the same book, you say providence did something, there are natures, well, what's the material, what's the atomic weight of the nature of dogs? The nature is an immaterial thing. If it's just a concept, then it doesn't actually exist, it's only in the mind. Are you saying it's a real thing? Then it's not physical. Therefore, materialism is false. If there's one thing that exists that isn't purely physical, then materialism is completely false. You see the force of that. They're committed to such an extreme view of reality that you just be creative to point out examples, and there are so many, of like what is the atomic weight of justice, like actual justice. Show me what it looks like in a microscope. You've said that everything's material, then tell me what's the wavelength. Okay, you put energy waves in there too that aren't technically material, but they're physical. They're the physical universe. So what's the wavelength of love? I mean, it's absurd. But people talk about materialism when it gives them the moral relativism that they want, or the no God that they want. But they don't want to talk about materialism or embrace it when things like love and justice and even the laws of logic. What is the material composition of the law of non-contradiction? It's impossible to be a materialist, a consistent materialist, about all of reality, and he's trying to have it both ways in his book. So they mounted a consistent, of course, the Nazis, attack upon what they viewed as exaggerated Christian compassion for the weak individual. So this is getting into like Mother Teresa. You've heard probably, we talk a lot about, hospitals, universities. These were Christian products. Christians who wanted to care for those who couldn't care for themselves, hospitals, orphanages, universities. It's a place for, being uneducated is a bad thing. We want to educate people because that's the image of God, and we're feeding that image of God. It turned into universities. What they're saying is that's a bad thing, because this included a rejection of the Christian principle of caritas, or charity, and the church's commandment to attend to the incurably ill person and render him aid unto his death. Like that's a bad thing. Like Mother Teresa, just caring for the Puris, they were called. That's their caste system, the lowest of the low. You guys know about the stories of people in higher caste would walk right past someone who's dying, decomposing before their eyes, because your karma. I don't know what you did, but sometime in your past life you deserve this. And if I feed you, then I'm going to interrupt your karma because you need to pay for something. And if I help you, I'm hurting your journey up to nirvana. You see, that's the Buddhist and the Hindu, in this case Hindu, belief system. And Mother Teresa comes in and says, no, this is a precious young man, old man, this is a precious image bearer of God. And them decomposing on the road is evil. So she, would pick him up and feed him, and she got some pushback by people who are saying you're interrupting their karma. They would agree with the Hindus in this, that, just, no, I think we had this in utilitarianism, wasn't that, when he was saying that Christianity actually erodes this natural process. It stops this Darwinian process of getting better and better by bad genes are dying off. We as humans do the stupid thing of perpetuating bad genes by caring for the poor, the infirm, the sick. That's actually, I think it was in The Descent of Man he actually made that point too, that we're harming our species by caring for the weak. And they're agreeing there. Hitler and the Nazis took it further to say, and prune them off, the branches that are bad. Okay, you guys remember our buddy? So sometimes Hitler spoke, this is Machiavelli, by the way. He spoke as an enemy to Christianity and sometimes as a friend. So why did he do that? What did Machiavelli instruct princes to do? Remember that? He was the very first one we did.
Appear religious.
Whatever serves your purpose to advance your own agenda. And
Lie through
power.
your teeth if you have to. And remember the famous story that he did, the prince. He wanted to do something. He wanted to oppress a group of people and whip them into shape. But if he did it, then they would have resentment toward him. So he got a general to do it. Everyone started hating the general, but they got whipped into shape. And then he killed the general, so he's also their hero, but they're also whipped into shape. And that's the manipulation. That's Hitler, man. He was really good at that kind of stuff. So he was Machiavellian all the way. And I was, when I was in undergrad, I went to Eastern Michigan, state school, and I took a class on Bible history of the Bible. I took 2 classes from this guy, world religions, which was a requirement, and then I had an elective, so I'm like, yeah, I'll take a Bible class, that's cool. And he's as liberal as they come, not a Christian at all, not a believer. I think he does believe in a higher power, maybe, but he does not believe Christianity is true. I've actually stayed in touch with him, and even a year or so ago, we had a couple long conversations. We were trying to get an event together with SES, so we got to be friends. But it was because I would talk back to him or ask questions in a respectful way. And he told me, he goes, I liked how you did it. It wasn't disrespectful. He goes, I actually care. I like that you cared about the subject better than all these other guys that were just bored and getting their grade or whatever. Because I'd rather argue with a student than. So he loved it. He says, he told me the students today are, because I'm really worried about our future. Because they are just horrible, he said, in terms of thinking and demanding an A even though they didn't earn it, and arguing with them about grades. It's like, you're not arguing with me, I'm your professor. I'm the one that tells you if you know the subject or not. What do you know? You're the student. So anyway, but the point is, he made the comment, it was when, is it Yitzhak Rabin that got assassinated? I forget his name, but he was the prime minister of Israel. It was in 1992, right around there. I think it was when I was in that class, 92, 93. So the prime minister of Israel got assassinated, and everyone was, it's a big deal when something like that happens in Israel. The thought was, well, if this was like Iran that was behind it, oh my gosh, this is going to spark off a war. So everyone was kind of scared. So he came in class when they discovered the next day, and he said, this is a horrible thing. But because I was really relieved that it was a Jewish assassin. He said, just because of what would have happened, it would have been a major thing. Because Israel has the ability to kick a lot of butt. They got nuclear bombs, but they're restrained because they understand that's quote the nuclear option. So he was scared, and so he made this comment. I was really glad, and he says, it's interesting. 1 out of every 2 Jews in the past 2,000 years has been murdered. And he says, and most of them at the hands of Christians. And I was like, wait a second. Because obviously that calculation has to include the 6 million Jews that Hitler killed off. And I said, are you calling Hitler a Christian? And he says, well, the Lutheran Church endorsed him. And I said, yeah, sure, after he locked up Bonhoeffer and anybody else who spoke out again. You kill off or imprison or whatever people who disagree with you. There's going to be Lutherans by name who are left who are like, okay, fine, whatever. Yeah, you're the Führer. You're great. Don't kill me. I don't even believe this stuff. I'm just here. There's Christians. There's people in every church that are that type of Christian. They don't really believe it. And if Hitler comes, someone like Hitler, they're the ones that are going to be like, yeah, cool. If Jesus would have been a Nazi, yeah, sure. That's what they said. So we argued back and forth, and he said, well, let's talk after class, and that's how we became friends. I was like, I just don't think it's responsible for you as a scholar to make that claim. That's just, and so the next week, he actually said, I made a comment last week, blah, 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 this was the comment, and I think it could be misunderstood, and I want to say that there is another side to that it's not necessarily, he wouldn't back down and say that I was right, but he said it is a fair objection to call into question Hitler's Christianity. And so I'd like, cool, all right. And of course, no one else cared. They were still sleeping and just wanted to go great. But he and I were like, oh, that's great. So the point is that Hitler used Christianity at times. Got a couple quotes we're going to come up here, but you've already seen from the chapter. When necessary, it's a very religious group of people. He would make sure he used religion as needed. That's very Machiavellian. Lie to them, and then chop their legs off when you're ready to do that too. You got what you needed out of them. They did the work because they believed they were morally responsible or whatever. Nationalism is actually a Christian concept. Caring for your group, your family and your community, and by extension your nation. That's a very biblical concept. So he wanted to tap into that where people were really true Christians. There is something of the Platonist, this is where I want to get there, however, perverted in Hitler. So this is important, however he put the word perverted in there. We're not saying people who are Platonists, people who follow Plato's philosophy are going to become Hitler. But we are going to say that he did use Plato's understanding of reality was Hitler's understanding of reality, basically. I'm not sure how much he understood because, like he said, he wasn't an A student. But he saw himself as a visionary who beheld an ideal. So that's an important word, ideal. An ideal world peopled by an ideal, again, humanity. So those are important words. What does he mean by ideals? What did Hitler mean? What did Plato mean? We're going to talk about that. This is the famous Plato's cave. This is $1 million analogy to know, because if you meet people that are into philosophy, this is like Plato 101. This is what Plato thought. Now, back up a step. The Greek philosophers, they would see, let's say, a tree or a cow, something that appears in nature, not a chair that's an artifact, but the tree that the chair was made out of, or the cow that the hamburger was made out of, or the leather jacket was made out of. They look at these things and they say, okay, I know that's a cow. Everyone looks at this and says cow. But then there's a cow over there, and I say, that's cow. How do I know that? They're not the same thing. What am I getting from my senses that tells me that these are both cows? Okay, so let's wrestle with that. Even the ones like him and Epicurus and others that came up with wrong solutions, I think Plato was wrong, but there are Christian Platonists. They had the right questions that they were asking. I mean, it sounds duh, but this is what philosophy does. How is it that I know these are all cows or these are all trees? Trees are even different because it's a birch tree and a what do you call it, the big red oaks or the California, the redwoods.
Redwoods.
So you see a little twig almost birch tree with white wrap around and then a redwood. How is it that you can say they're both trees? So they were pointing to some good questions. And his answer was this cave. So he said, so cow. There is something, well, hey, let me do the picture first. Okay, these are all the people. We're called prisoners because we're trapped in this world that's not the real world. This is a shadow world. I don't know why, but he put people back there manipulating it, but they call them puppeteers for them to perform. So there's a fire in the cave that casts a shadow on the wall, and these people are just looking at the shadow. This guy has the actual cat. That's cat. So let's say cow, okay? There's a cow, an actual, they calls them the form. The form of cowness exists in this like Platonic heaven, some people call it. So back here, there is this thing called cow, and we're seeing just a reflection of it. But there are multiple reflections of it. Each of those shadows of cows are just shadows of the real single cow that exists. There's a cow, and that's the form. So that's what Plato said is the reason you can know that's a cow, that's a cow, that's a cow. What you actually mean is I'm seeing a shadow of a cow, but because there's this form back here, I abstract that into I know that form or something about the form, but I only know a shadow of it. Christian Platonists will point out the Bible verse where Paul says, we see dimly, but someday we'll see clearly. They take that as, see, Paul was saying that we're going to see everything for what it is. The problem with Platonism, just as a quick thing, is all those forms are eternal and coexist with God. There are a lot of problems with that. That God is the only self-existent, eternal being. So what do you do with all of these forms? It's difficult for them. We had a whole debate in our college, major nerdy debate, but it's called God and Abstract Objects, and that's what they debated. Plato, nominalism. Nominalist is the modern philosophy that says there's no such thing as anything that unites all of these things called trees. That's just our name. That's what nominalism means. We give that name to all these things, but there's nothing really that unites those things together. It's just what we call trees. William Lane Craig is a nominalist.
Yeah.
One of the reasons we don't agree with him is that's a big problem there, I think, spiritually. What is it that makes you a human and Al a human? He would say, well, we just call those two things human. There isn't something called humanity, humanness. So, this is what Plato's cave is. This is what Hitler was tapping into when he said ideal. So an ideal is another word for the form. So that's an ideal, that's a shadow of the ideal. He was trying to get, his project was, we have a bunch of shadows here because we've got crippled people and Jews and all, but if we can prune mankind back to the original form, then we will have reached heaven on earth. That was his Platonic vision of eugenics. You can see eugenics in there too. Eugenics is more of the tool on how to do it, but he thinks there's this form of humanness that is the perfect form, and he was trying to prune off everything that wasn't that to get to that perfect form. The Aryan is what he thought was the perfect form of humanity. Does that make sense of what, at least his philosophical category, this is what the way he viewed mankind through Plato. Of course, he had Nietzsche in there. There's no God, so do what you want. You should actually work to make your life better through force. That's in there too. But any questions about the cave? Was it a little bit too nerdy? You're not going to be sharing your faith next week and bring up Plato's cave, probably. But if it comes up, you can be like, yeah, I heard about that. It's it just sounds weird to me. I don't think that's the way things are. And incidentally, Aristotle came along and said, no, there isn't a place up there where all the forms of catness and treeness and cowness and all this exist. The form is there's a nature of cow that's universal. And when you see, touch, taste, when your senses tell you cow, your mind unites with the form to form the idea of cow in your mind. So it's not tapping into something that's other than your mind. It's actually your mind and senses working the way God made them, so you can see reality for what it is. You use the analogy with Descartes. Remember, there's the person, and then there's the object, and there's this gap, because you can't know that tree for sure. How do you know that your senses aren't fooling you? Because we've all seen magicians or whatever trick us, so you can't trust your senses. And how do you know that tree is a tree? You don't know all trees. How can you make that broad of a statement? And so he had this gap there. Aristotle was like, no. If that tree and your senses coming together doesn't say tree, then there's something wrong with you. Because if you just know these things, 10% of the battery left, we can do it. that's what Aristotle's answer was, and I think it's the right answer, and Thomas Aquinas followed it. And basically, it's God made you to know things, and unless something's wrong with your senses, literally like you can't see, you hear, whatever, some of your senses still work. Unless there's something wrong with your mind or your senses, you're going to know the external world for real. And according to Romans 1, that knowledge of the external world, the created, gives you knowledge of God. So it starts with your senses and moves right to knowledge of God. And then you go to a Bible and you're reading stuff, you're like, yeah, this affirms everything that I know from my senses and my intellect. So that's the philosophical beauty of what we're talking about with Aquinas and Aristotle. The philosopher, as we understand him, will make use of religions for his project of cultivation and education, just as he will make use of whatever political and economic states are at hand. Nietzsche. So we did him, 2-3 lessons ago. It's just a tool. Hey, if religion's going to get something done, you got Machiavelli in there too. Yeah, fine. God wants us to be the mother race. That's fine. We don't. Eventually, we're going to kill you if you think there's a God. But for right now, yeah, sure, you can believe in God. It sounds a little bit like politicians. Every politician's a Christian, right? Oh yeah, I believe in God. Yeah, right. That's Machiavelli, and that's Nietzsche in our political system. Yeah, tell them you're a Christian if that's going to get you elected, especially if it's in the Bible Belt. So, Hillary Clinton, claims, again, we don't know anyone's heart. I'm not making that kind of judgment, but I can say all the things that she fights for are antithetical to what Jesus stands for and what Christian beliefs are. So that judgment you can make.
Every decision that she made was consistent with atheism, and none of her decisions are consistent with being a Christian.
She's a fierce Machiavelli the prince. Like, just do whatever it takes. That guy's gonna testify against you? Off him, kill him. Oh, my hard drive is gonna just erase it, wipe it, just whatever it takes, and just lie about it or confuse or just with no shame whatsoever. Not even a hint of I'm embarrassed by getting caught. Nah, they do that. I mean, it's just uncanny. And Bill's good at it in a different way, but there is.
Epstein shouldn't even think about asking for bail. He knows what's
Hillary
good for
Clinton
him.
was one thing, but Barbara Bush, she never denounced abortion. In fact, in her biography, is very pro-abort. And Barbara Bush is considered our American grandmother, but
the Bush family is more liberal than most of us would be comfortable with. George W. is the most conservative. Yeah.
And his wife is a Democrat liberal.
But
Yeah, about certain things. She's a teacher, so she believes in unions and
Well, but before she was.
Yeah. It's interesting. Yeah, you're right. And HW was definitely more liberal than I'm comfortable with. But, compared to, was it Dukakis he ran against? All right,
Oh, yeah.
he's the most conservative. I'm going with that.
I'm just talking about your beliefs and what you say you're a Christian. She's considered this great grandmother, but she really wasn't that.
Yeah,
Talk about
I
what she
wonder,
did.
because now HW, all of his policies were pro-life, and he didn't do anything that was. So I almost am like, okay, just as long as you do the right things in office, that's between you and God, what you believe. We're hiring them to do a job, and we don't hire the first lady. We hire or the first husband. We could have. We hire the president, whoever that's going to be. We expect them to do a job, and hopefully we'll do it. And even if they don't believe it, I don't care, actually. I want them to appoint judges and sign bills and do the things that will make the country better. But a couple weeks ago we did Margaret Sanger, where we talked about how initially only the Catholics were outraged at what she was suggesting through forced sterilization. Of course, abortion is just the final thing. I guess maybe infanticide would be the final option for people who want to prune the human gene pool. But evangelicals Roe v. Wade, evangelicals were not up in arms initially. And so that's why I'm wondering if maybe she is from that sort of tradition where, I don't know, and maybe she has a strand of feminism that she's inherited from our culture. You put those two together, and it can make, at least for a softer opposition to life issues. And I think it's important to always remember, because it's not in our face right now, but it's going to come up again. Euthanasia. I'm from Michigan. 3 miles that way, Norm Geisler grew up. 3 miles that way was Jack Kevorkian. I mean, I worked in that city. But Bloomfield Hills is next to Troy. They butt up against each other. That was an embarrassing time to have Kevorkian constantly be in the news. But that's something I think the church we have the right position. I've never heard anyone in evangelicalism teach something wrong about euthanasia. But why is euthanasia wrong? You have to give arguments, and the awesome thing, it's the exact same argument as for abortion. It's a little more nuanced because you have things like care for the elderly, and when do you stop the feeding tube? It gets a little bit more nuanced, but I think Christians need to bolster up their arguments or their understanding of all those issues too, because the abortion issue and the infanticide issue is so easy to, like, man, if you don't understand this, well, that's something really wrong, because now we have the pictures and all that. If you don't you don't agree with this, again, as you know, Christians have the same percentage of abortions as non-Christians. So I'm talking about having the right beliefs, not doing the right thing all the time. And with euthanasia, same thing. Why is it wrong to obviously kill people? I didn't mean to bring up this subject at all, but there's a movie called Breathe that came out a couple years ago by the guy who played Gollum in Lord of the Rings. He has a production company, and if you look at the trailer for it, it's a true story about a guy who got polio, and then they cured him, I guess, but they paralyzed him. And so they gave him an emergency trach and a breathing tube just so he wouldn't die on the spot. But then he survived the polio, and he's like, okay, well now what? I'm a vegetable. His wife had gotten pregnant already. And they had a great life. They made it out like it was just a man who loved life and had a lot to offer. But now he's a vegetable. And this is in the 20s to 30s. It was early on in medicine in America. And he's the true story of a man who pushed the envelope for people in that situation to be able to get out. So he's the one that, he didn't build it, but he asked people to do things and basically invented the portable breathing machine that you would attach to a chair initially. And then, so it allowed people who have that condition to get out and breathe. So that was in the trailer. We're like, hey, let's watch this with Tim, our youngest. And we're all just watching it, and it's moving. It's a really good story. But at the end, after 30 years, I think it was, 30 plus years that he survived, it's amazing. He was supposed to die. These people don't live very long, especially back then, they're bedridden. But he lived 3 decades. That much of breathing tube, doing the breathing for you without your body's filters that take the abrasion of the air off, it just had rubbed his tracheal tube, bronchial tube so much that it was just starting to bleed all over. And so he was slowly choking in his own blood. And the doctor said, just look, one night you're going to drown in your own blood. There's nothing you can do about it. Unless someone's watching you constantly and they're there to suction it out. That's how you're going to die. And so it was tragic. And this is where I felt violated as a movie viewer. Tim was up in arms, my little son Tim, he was up in arms. He was like, what? And he's like, I can't believe they just did that to us. He decided to take a lethal injection. He had a doctor friend that was willing to do it. And so he was going to kill himself. And the whole last part of the story was his wife, he's asking his wife and son to, look, this is my choice, this is freedom of choice, support me in this. And finally they came around and they threw a party. All the friends came over, and it was a death party. It was, these are real, they're in, it's in the news sometimes, that dying with dignity type of thing. So you invite all your friends that have meaning, and look, this is gonna be your last shot to talk to me, I'm gonna kill myself, or they don't say it like that, but I'm gonna get the lethal injection to save me from the suffering. and everyone was just, oh, you're so great, and it's so brave, and it's been an honor, and I'm really glad you're doing this. It's a good, brave choice, and just praising it. Well, the guy who wrote and directed it, who's the partner in the film company with Gollum, the guy who plays Gollum, Andy Serkis, he's the guy who wrote and directed it. It was the story of his dad. He was actually the boy, and this is his dad's life story. And he wanted to make this story as an apologetic for the euthanasia movement, for physician-assisted suicide. Because this was in England, so it wasn't illegal, I guess. It was called frowned upon, but this doctor friend of his did it. I felt really, really like that was cheap for the ads to be constantly looking like it's a love story, the perseverance of the human spirit.
Right, the human spirit.
Yeah, that's totally what if you look at the trailers, there's no indication that it's going to be a celebration of assisted suicide. So again, because I'm from Michigan and the co-working thing was in my face, I was mad. And I was also mad because they did a really good job making the film. It's really well done. So.
In the Wikipedia says, in the overview, it was the very last paragraph, he said, emerges from the hospital ward and devotes the rest of his life to helping fellow patients and the disabled.
Sounds beautiful,
That's
doesn't
it.
it?
I'm gonna watch it.
Yeah, just put one more word at the end of that. Die. Helping his.
Well, but they would say, no, he helped him live, and obviously I'm not about death. I've done all this to help people live. But when it's time, or when someone decides to die, then you should let them die, and do it with physician's assistance. So it's an apologetic argument for that, and it didn't do great in the theater, and maybe it's because word got out and people were like, oh my gosh, don't go see that movie. But if you want to study or see what the culture is giving us, it's a good film to watch because it was very, very well done and maddening. So okay, this is end on because I got 5% of battery left. It might die out. Theories of truth. This is something we cover in the 12 steps, or I don't have my faith of an atheist. What does it mean to say something's true? So this room is, that chair is on the floor. Okay, that statement is true because the chair's on the floor. There is not a pink elephant in the room right now. That's a true statement because there's actually not a pink elephant in the room. Saying obvious things right here. That's what's called the correspondence view of truth, which is what we argue for as classical theists. Not every Christian actually holds this, but what we mean is a statement is true because it corresponds to reality. It's kind of one of those, yeah, I think that's, but there are Christians who, when we say, well, what does it mean that the Word of God is true? Well, we would say that, well, when it says that Jesus went up to the Mount of Olives, it's true because Jesus went up to the Mount of Olives. It corresponds to reality. So history text can be the same thing. So the Christians that come along and say, well, John changed the date of the crucifixion to make a theological point, we come and we say, well, how does that correspond to reality? He didn't get crucified on Thursday. You admit that. You say John knew that, but he said that, and therefore it doesn't correspond to reality. They would say, yeah, but he had an intentionalist view of truth. What truth actually is, what was the intention of the person saying it? If they intended to teach something true, then that statement is true. So you see how, that's why Norm was just going, what? Because you put this in print. Are you crazy? Do you not see that all of your interpretation of the Bible, if you're consistent, it's out the window? And one thing that one of our other professors, Richard Howe, actually has said before, he goes, because Michael Kona points to several things in the Gospels and says this intentionalist view of truth, it's just, he's working within this genre. His readers knew it. We just don't know it because we're idiots from the 21st century. But everyone knew that, okay, he's working in the Greco-Roman genre. What he means by it is this. His intention is this. So Richard Howe says, well, why not the whole gospel then? What the whole thing is just didn't actually happen in history, but the intention of the author was to say God loves us and we can go to heaven if I don't know, if he didn't really die. and rise again, it gets really slippery. So pragmatic view of truth, of course, is the view that Hitler and Machiavelli, hey, look, if it works, it's true. If you get away with it, it's good, it's true. This is the Clintons, this is, so if something works, that's all the standard that you have. And the the coherence view of truth is, this belief system you have is internally coherent. It makes sense, all the things, it doesn't matter if they actually reflect reality, but it makes sense in its own system. It's true. That's the coherence view. And there are actually 9 of them, I just put these. The interesting, the apologetic is similar to no sentences have 5 words. It's like this. Okay, so you think, Michael Kona, you think that the intention of the gospel writer is what makes it true. He intended to teach something that was true. And so the fact that it was written down, it doesn't correspond to history. So you say intentionalism is the definition of truth. But does that definition of truth correspond to reality? See, he's saying, I want you to have a correspondence view of what I'm saying. I'm trying to say that pragmatic view of truth is actually the definition of truth. It corresponds to the reality of what truth is. You see what's happening? You have to use the correspondence view of truth to state any of the other views of truth that deny correspondence. Because they're trying to say that it corresponds to reality. Does that make sense? It's just it's one of those what Frank Turek calls the roadrunner moments where Coyote's running and there's a cloud of smoke that's been kicked up, and he's just standing there, his head's out of the smoke, but then when it dissipates, he realizes he's standing on nothing. He went over the edge of the canyon, he looks dumb for a second, and then he falls, not to his death, because he's right back in the next scene there, but the roadrunner tactic is you demonstrate that, look, you have no ground to stand on. You're standing in thin air. If you think that correspondence view truth is false, then any definition you give for truth, you say corresponds to reality, which means correspondence is true, which was you were wrong to begin with. How about just adopt correspondence and go back to the Bible and say, okay, John was writing something that corresponded to truth. If this is a true statement, it corresponded. So I'm missing something as a 21st century reader if I think that there's a contradiction between this and the Bible. What might it be that I'm missing? It just completely changes your hermeneutics, your biblical interpretation, when you start with these pre-thoughts of philosophy, really is what it is, metaphysics. And you avoid a lot of mistakes that the church is, and again, getting back to, hey, what does that, I guess it would be, what does that Bible verse mean to you? I don't care what it means to me. I don't care what it means to you. What does it mean? And then how do you apply it in your life is what I think most of the time that's what people are meaning when they say that, ask that question. But it's an example of having a bad view of truth being applied to Bible study and small group Bible study. So that's the end of Hitler. But I brought that up because Hitler was doing this left and right. I'm like, this is crazy. He's denying. He's using the intentionalist view of truth, but he's saying that it corresponds to reality. He's contradicting himself over and over and over, like we pointed out. He's wrong because he's evil, but he's also, before he was evil, he was illogical. And isn't it better to attack it at that level, at that state in history, that stage of history, so that we haven't had deaths and wars? And that's the cry of apologetics and philosophy. Engage in ideas so you don't have to wait until armies are moving across borders. Next week is Sigmund Freud. I minored in psychology. I wanted to go on and major in it, and then I realized I don't like psychology. I like philosophy. What I thought psychology was is actually philosophy. These guys are a bunch of knuckleheads. But he said some interesting things, and I actually think Freud gave us some good things and give us some gifts as how to look at reality. So he wasn't completely wrong. So things like the subconscious, nobody talked about the subconscious, but now it's just normal for us to talk about, well, why'd you dream that? Well, your subconscious was working this or that out, or it wasn't this mystical experience. God was always, God can't be responsible for all our dreams, right? That would be weird. And he wrote us, 66 books. Why does he have to use dreams to tell us anything else? So Freud did give us something, and next week we'll talk about the ways that he screwed up the world. So he
Well,
didn't.
I have a question. Next week is Vacation Bible School. I don't know that it affects any of us.
Yeah, that's a good question. It probably shouldn't, because they never come up here.
Right.
And I haven't gotten any emails saying that they're canceled. We're one of the few groups that are meeting
Right.
throughout the summer, so maybe I'll check. And also, in the next few weeks, I'm going to be asking them to order all the booklets and the DVD, master DVD for the next study that we're going to do. And so maybe.
What was that study again?
send those out. I gotta get the actual name of it. It's not The God Who Speaks. That was the documentary the American Family did about the doctrine of inerrancy or the Bible, what it is. This is something about the God's words. I can't remember the title of it. I'm gonna get that.
It's the one that Professor Howes and.
Yeah. He's the one he's the consultant that did the whole thing for him. Content even that he wasn't on the screen, it's actually him that's directing it. And there are a few other, I think Dr. Land's on there, I think we've got another professor. It's very SCS, it's very Norm Geisler. It's good, it's a good documentary. Or it's a small group Bible study. And like I said, I'm hoping it brings more people in so that we really can't be in this room anymore. We gotta go someplace bigger. And it's not because we, really wanted more numbers, but after last week going through it, all of us just at SCS and in the world of apologetics, classical apologetics, we just got a new fire under us. Like, we gotta do this, man. He's dead, he's gone, it's up to us. We can't go back.
We
to
need more numbers.
That's why I'm saying that we need more numbers. We need more numbers because we want more good to happen.